three different types of muscle tissue to be aware of: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. Before I put it up there, what do you think a way to categorize skeletal muscle would be? What are like your tip-offs that you're looking at skeletal muscle?
Can we lose this?
We can. Yeah, if you think. I don't think it'll be too bad when.
Thank you.
Okay. Anyone know some tip-offs when you look at skeletal muscle? What it could be?
Excuse me.
Striations. Yeah, there's striations, obviously. But where else are you going to see striations? What other type of muscle? Cardiac muscle, you'll see it also. Okay? So you got to differentiate cardiac from skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle tends to have cells. What's the other name for a skeletal muscle cell? A skeletal muscle fiber. Okay? It has fibers that are really long and straight. Whereas with cardiac muscle, they branch. Okay. The other thing is skeletal muscle cells are multinucleated. What does that mean? They have more than one nuclei. They have lots of nuclei. Okay. So long, straight, cylinder-shaped cells with lots of nuclei. It's going to have stripes. Cardiac muscle cells, shorter cells that branch. They have stripes, but then they tend to have just one nuclei in each cell. Does anyone remember the other characteristic you see in cardiac muscle tissue?
Intercalated discs?
I think I know what this means.
I forgot what they're called.
Cardiac, intercalated discs? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, there was some sort of...
There's gap junctions there
Gap
that connect,
junctions,
yeah, that
that's
are
what
inside
I
of
was-
them. All right, that's another tip-off. And then with smooth muscle, what don't you see in smooth muscle? No striations, right? The nuclei, the cells themselves have what's called a spindle shape or a fusiform shape. That just means that they kind of look like this. They're thin at the ends, wide in the middle, and then they taper again at the end. So kind of like that, okay? And you picture a whole bunch of smooth muscle cells. They'd be sitting basically like this, okay?
And there are 50 questions on this lab practical?
There's 50 questions, yeah. The other thing with smooth muscle is the nuclei tend to be really elongated like this. Okay? All right, so let me show you these. I just wanted to talk it through before I put them up. Someplace here. That's weird. I must be using... Okay, so here we go. What's this?
Skeletal muscle.
Yeah, that's skeletal muscle, all right? Each one of these guys is a skeletal muscle fiber, all right? So you're basically seeing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 skeletal muscle fibers. They're really, really long cells. One of these cells, like if you're talking about, say, your biceps, okay, it's gonna that single cell is gonna span the entire length of that muscle. So they're very, very long cells. All right. Notice also that each one of these cells has several of these little purple things. What are the little purple things?
Nuclei.
Those are the nuclei. Okay. The way there's so much stuff jam-packed into skeletal muscle cells that the nuclei tends to be sort of pushed to the sides. Okay. These ones were probably pushed to the sides too. It's just how they cut it. You know, picture these being cylinders. They were probably on the side too. But the nuclei tend to get pushed to the side because there's so much junk inside of the cytoplasm that I'll talk about in a second. All right. You can clearly see, what are these things? Yeah, those are the striations. All right. So that's what a skeletal muscle cell is going to look like. Here's another one. But, you know, they all pretty much look the same. Long, straight cells, nuclei that are pushed off to the side, and then lots of nuclei, and obviously the stripes. Okay. So that's skeletal muscle cells. Cardiac muscle cells, let me go to, I think this is the one I wanted. Yeah, here's a cardiac muscle cell. All right. Notice, see the stripes, okay? You still have striations. But instead of having nice, straight cells, fibers, see how it kind of branches and goes off in different directions as it's going? It's a branching type of a pattern. All right. The other thing, too, is these little guys represent the intercalated discs. Okay. The intercalated discs are basically where one skeletal muscle cell attaches to, where one cardiac muscle cell attaches to another cardiac muscle cell. Right? You don't have a cardiac muscle cell that spans the entire length of your heart. Instead, they're smaller cells that attach to each other at these intercalated discs. And the other tip-off too is usually each cardiac muscle cell has just a single nuclei in it. And usually it's a fairly big nuclei, and usually it's somewhere around the middle of the cardiac muscle cell. All of those things are tip-offs that you're looking at cardiac muscle tissue. Here's another picture of cardiac muscle. It's a little bit more difficult in this slide to see the striations. You can kind of see them a little bit there. It's just not focused in as well. But these darker structures, these represent the intercalated discs. Okay, that's where one skeletal muscle. That's where one I keep saying this. Sorry. It's where one cardiac muscle cell attaches to another cardiac muscle cell. And many of the nuclei are really, really big. They're not smushed, and you don't see nearly as many of them as you do with the skeletal muscle. And the last type is the smooth muscle. Okay, smooth muscle, you're not going to see striations. That's why it's named smooth. All right. And if you could see the shape of the cells, it's kind of hard to see the cell borders, but the shape of the cells is basically that spindle shape. And each one of these guys represents one of those really long, sort of stretched out nuclei. So that's what smooth muscle looks like. Here's another picture. Okay? More smooth muscle. So definitely know those three types. Now I want to turn this light on for just a second and show you something else. Okay, going right along, there's something called skeletal muscle organization. All right, this is some stuff we'll cover more in class on Thursday, but I might as well mention it now. All right, some of this stuff we covered already. All right, what's the name for an individual skeletal muscle cell? A muscle fiber. All right, so you've got a muscle fiber. Okay. Now, if you put a bunch of muscle fibers together, what do you call that when you have a bunch of muscle fibers together? Well, okay, hold on a second. Hold on. You're all right. Okay. When you put a bunch of muscle fibers together, it's called a fascicle. All right. Let me go in parentheses here. What's the connective tissue that surrounds a single muscle fiber called? And the endomysium is the connective tissue that surrounds it, right? Okay. And what holds the fascicles together? What surrounds a fascicle?
Perimysium?
Yeah, the perimysium. Just so you refresh with where those names are. Now, if you put all the fascicles together, what do you get? You get the entire muscle, all right? Be it your biceps, triceps, quads, whatever you want, whatever muscle you're talking about, all right? So, bunch of muscle fibers together makes a fascicle. All of the fascicles together makes the entire muscle. What's the connective tissue layer that surrounds the entire muscle? The epimysium. Okay. That's what you learned in lecture today. All right. Now, what I didn't tell you, or what I just briefly mentioned during lecture, was that there's things even smaller that contribute to this. All right. There's something called, the next smaller thing down from a muscle fiber is something called a myofibril. Okay. And then even smaller than that is what are called filaments or myofilaments. Okay. So what happens is you have these really teensy-tiny myofilaments. Okay. And by the way, these myofilaments come in two types. There's either what are called thick filaments. The name like thick filaments, what do you suppose the other kind is? Thin filaments. Thick and thin filaments. These guys are really small. Now you've probably heard, has anyone heard the terms actin and myosin before? Anyone from a previous biology class or something? Actin is the main protein in the thin filaments. Myosin is the main protein in the thick filaments. All right? Anyway, you have these really, really small myofilaments. It's actually the myofilaments that are sliding past each other. When a muscle contracts, it's the sliding past of each other of the myofilaments. All right? So lots and lots of myofilaments. The myofilaments, if you take a bundle of myofilaments and put them together, that's called a myofibril. Okay? You put a bunch of myofibrils together, and you get a muscle fiber. All right? So, okay, from big to small, myofilaments, a bunch of them together gives you a myofibril. A bunch of myofibrils together gives you the muscle fiber. A bunch of muscle fibers together gives you the fascicle. A bunch of fascicles together gives you the entire muscle. Okay? Myofibrils are kind of like the organelles that make up muscle fibers. Okay? Myofibrils, so in other words, myofibrils are like any of the organelles that you'd find in other cells. Okay? Like your endoplasmic reticulum or things like that. All right, that's the organization that you're going to need to know. For the microscopic anatomy of a skeletal muscle fiber, we have a couple models roaming around. Let me show you this model. That's the best way to do this. Okay. So, this whole model represents a single skeletal muscle fiber. All right, so one muscle cell. That's what this whole model shows you. Now, one other thing that they show you on this model is this little guy that's curving around here that's attached to the muscle cell. What do you suppose this guy is that's attached to the muscle cell?
A nerve.
It's a nerve, okay? This is a nerve that's going to stimulate this muscle cell, okay? We'll talk about that more on Thursday, all right? So this is a single muscle cell. That's the nerve that's attached to it, okay? These big guys, let me give them the light a little bit more. These big guys that you see, there's like 7 of these guys, okay? Those represent the myofibrils, okay? And there's like, what is it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of them in this model, okay? Those are the myofibrils. The little tiny dots that you see inside of the myofibrils, those represent the myofilaments, okay? It may be tough to see from where you're sitting, but some of these dots are fairly big. Some of them are fairly small. The big dots represent the thick filaments. The smaller dots represent the thin filaments. Okay. All right. Other things I can show you on this model. Okay. The outer part of the muscle cell is shown right here. That's the cell membrane of the muscle cell. The cell membrane of the muscle cell, unfortunately, has a special name that you need to know. All right? It's called the sarcolemma. There's another name you need to know too. You can't call the cytoplasm well, I mean you can, but there's a more specific name for the cytoplasm inside of a muscle cell. It's called the sarcoplasm. So myo, like if you see my, that refers to muscle. Sarco also is a prefix that refers to muscle. All right. So this is just the cytoplasm inside a muscle cell. All right. So on this model, the very outermost thing that you're seeing here, that actually on this model, that actually represents the endomysium. All right, that's the connective tissue that's surrounding the muscle fiber. The next layer that you see is the sarcolemma. That's the cell membrane. Okay. In this particular model, once you get inside of the sarcolemma, you then have this guy that they're showing up here. which is actually the nucleus. Okay, see how it's pushed to the side? It's pushed very close to the sarcolemma. Okay, this is just showing you a small portion. Obviously, if I could show you a big, long model, you'd see many, many nuclei inside of it. Okay. All right, other things to talk about here on this model. When a muscle contracts, again, the reason I'm explaining this is because it'll make sense more for the anatomy. When a muscle contracts, what happens is you get tremendous amounts of calcium being released into the sarcoplasm. And when the calcium's released, it causes the little thick and thin filaments to slide past each other. And as they slide past each other, the muscle cell contracts. And if you picture all of the muscle cells in a muscle contracting at the same time, you get contraction of the entire muscle. But it's calcium that needs to be released inside of the sarcoplasm. And the calcium is actually stored, when the muscle's relaxed, the calcium is stored in something called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Okay? You have an endoplasmic, the sarcoplasmic reticulum is basically the smooth ER of a muscle cell. Lots of weird words to know. It's just that they refer specifically to things in a muscle cell. All right. So on this model, all of this stuff shown in white, that's all sarcoplasmic reticulum. Okay. And when a muscle's relaxed, lots and lots of calcium stored inside of the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Now, what happens physiologically, when you want a muscle to contract, you have to send a nerve signal from a motor neuron to that muscle cell to stimulate it. All right? Let me stick with this one second. Actually, you know what? Let me try this. I think it'll probably be a little bit better. So this is a close-up. This is, just to get your bearings, flip it up here. This is the motor neuron that's curving around. And this little spot here represents the spot where the motor neuron is connecting up with the muscle cell. All right? This area is known as the neuromuscular junction. All right? Now, at the neuromuscular junction, it's really just kind of like a connection. It's like a synapse that you'd have between a neuron and a neuron. In this case, it's a synapse between a neuron and a muscle cell. All right? But some of the same terms that you learned already still apply. So this end that's coming down here represents the axon that's coming down. The very end, these little bulbs represent the synaptic end bulbs, or the synaptic knobs. Okay? So here's a synaptic knob, there's a synaptic knob, there's a synaptic knob. What do you suppose these little greenish, yellowish dots represent? Yeah, they're vesicles. They represent the synaptic vesicles. What's inside of synaptic vesicles? Neurotransmitter. Okay. In the case of the neuromuscular junction, this makes your life a little easier. The neurotransmitter at the neuromuscular junction is always acetylcholine. Okay. So these are little synaptic vesicles. They have acetylcholine inside of them. Okay. The red area that's shown here is meant to represent the synaptic gap or the synaptic cleft, which you already learned about. The white area there represents the sarcolemma of the muscle cell. Okay? On the sarcolemma of the muscle cell, there will be little receptors for acetylcholine. Okay? So when you send a signal down a motor neuron, what happens is the motor neuron releases its synaptic vesicles, the acetylcholine moves across the synaptic cleft, and it binds to receptors on the sarcolemma of the muscle cell.
You're saying the white is the sarcolemma?
Correct. The white is the sarcolemma. It's not shown on this model, but picture little tiny receptors for acetylcholine that are embedded inside of that white. Okay. when the acetylcholine binds to those receptors, what happens is it triggers an action potential in the muscle. All right? We've talked about action potentials in neurons, but you can actually have action potentials in muscles too. They're called muscle action potentials. So those guys move across, they trigger an action potential inside of the motor neuron, inside of the muscle cell. The action potential moves down the entire length of the muscle cell. Okay? And what it ultimately is going to do, it's going to trigger the release of calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. It's going to cause these guys to dump their calcium into the sarcoplasm, and that's what's going to trigger a contraction. Okay? We'll get into the real details of the physiology there, but anyway, that's what happens. Motor neuron releases the synaptic vesicles. Synaptic vesicles stimulate the muscle cell to create an action potential. The action potential in the muscle cell triggers the release of calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and that's going to lead to contraction. All right? Now, some other names you should be aware of. Motor neurons, when they connect up with the muscle cell, okay, they don't connect up all over the place. There's usually just one area of the muscle cell that they connect to. All right? So you may have this really long, and it's usually in the middle of the muscle cell. So you have a really long skeletal muscle cell. It would be in the middle of that skeletal muscle cell, roughly where the motor neuron would connect. Okay? There's another name to learn. When you talk about the sarcolemma, that's right across from the motor neuron, in other words, the sarcolemma that has the receptors for acetylcholine on it, it has a special name. You call it the motor end plate. Everywhere else, like if I was over here, I would just refer to it as sarcolemma or sarcolemma over there. But when you specifically talk about the part of the sarcolemma that has the receptors that's right across, you refer to it as the motor end plate. Okay. All right. What are these little guys? Yeah, those are mitochondria. Okay. Just like over here, there's mitochondria. Why so many mitochondria inside of a muscle cell? Why do you need lots of mitochondria in a muscle cell?
Energy.
Yeah, you need energy, right? Your muscle cells are probably the most metabolically active cells in your body, so you need lots of energy in the form of ATP, which is made by your mitochondria. So, do you have a question?
Which one is synaptic cleft?
Which one is the what?
Synaptic cleft.
Oh, synaptic cleft is the red, okay?
Oh.
So the red area represents the synaptic cleft, or you can call it the synaptic gap. Okay? Whereas the stuff on this side represents the synaptic end bulbs of the motor neuron, and the white layer there represents the motor end plate of the muscle cell. Okay. All right. What else do I want to say? All right. So, told you the white on here is the sarcoplasmic reticulum, holds a lot of calcium. Okay. These little red guys that you see going across, okay, and they always go straight across a muscle cell, just like this. Okay. Those are something called the transverse tubules or the T-tubules. So these little red guys here, or there, or there, those are transverse tubules. Sitting along the transverse tubules, every transverse tubule in a skeletal muscle cell has two branches or two connections from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So they always come in a group of three. You have a transverse tubule in the middle, and then on either side of it, you have tubes coming from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Okay. Together, those three structures are what is called a triad. Triad means three. So a triad is a transverse tubule plus the two branches of sarcoplasmic reticulum that are on either side of it. So there's a triad, there's a triad, there's a triad. Okay. The reason for the transverse tubule is it's basically a tunnel that allows the outside of the muscle cell, for all intents and purposes, to sort of move in to the middle of the muscle cell. All right? So what that does is, when the motor neuron stimulates the muscle cell, the action potential moves down the outside of the muscle cell, just like it does in a neuron. Remember, when an action potential moves down an axon, it's moving along the the membrane of that axon. In a muscle cell, it does it the same way, but the fact that you have these T-tubules that connect up with the outer membrane, they allow the muscle action potential to not just travel on the outside of the muscle cell, they actually allow it to move in toward the inside, into the middle of the muscle cell. And what happens as the action potential moves into the inside, the reason why you have each transverse tubule being flanked by the sarcoplasmic reticulum is as it moves in, it stimulates the guys on either side of it to release calcium. That's what's triggering the calcium release. Right. I know this is a lot of physiology, but it's kind of like, just to say the words without giving you the physiology, I don't think you're going to remember it very well. So I just wanted to, we'll hit this again on Thursday. All right. Other things, let's see that I can show you on this. Transverse tubules. Okay. Again, each one of these guys represents an individual myofibril. The little dots inside are the myofilaments. If you look at them on cross-section, okay, like we're doing here, this wider one represents a thick filament, whereas these thinner ones that you see are the thin filaments. Okay? All right. I think that's all I want to say about this for now. I'll get into sarcomeres in a second. Well, I'll get into sarcomeres on Thursday. I think, well, one thing I want to mention about sarcomeres is if you take a myofibril, in other words, if you take one of these guys and you look at it sideways, okay, you see repeating segments that are called sarcomeres. So if you look at one myofibril from the side, you're going to see things that repeat all the way down the length of it.
Because of striation.
And that's what causes the striations. It's those sarcomeres on the myofibrils that cause the striations. You don't, so guess what? It probably comes as no surprise, you do not have sarcomeres in smooth muscle. You have it in cardiac muscle, you have it in skeletal muscle when it's smooth. That's all I want to say about sarcomeres for now, because there's a lot of weird stuff, there's a lot of details, things called an I band, an A band, a Z disc, it's like alphabet soup. There's all these weird names. I'll go into that on Thursday. All right, now let me go into the specific muscles, which is probably what you've been waiting for, but I had to hit all of this stuff first. So let me sit down with this guy as much as I can, until I can't handle that anymore. I'm going to use this guy because he's small and it's easy for me to point to, but you should be able to identify, you know, if I show you one of these other larger models of a leg or an arm, you should be able to find them on there as well. All right. So flip to the last page, and these are the muscles you're responsible for knowing. All right. Study this table really well, because there's a couple ways I could ask you questions on it. Okay. I could point to a muscle, right? I could say, you know, I could point to this. What's that muscle? Yeah, that's pectoralis major. Okay. I could point to that and say, what is this muscle, right? Or I could point to it and say, what's the origin of this muscle? Or what's the insertion of this muscle? Or what's the action of this muscle? All right, there's a number of ways that I could use this table to ask you questions. All right, or I could point to this one. What's this muscle?
Biceps.
Yeah, that's your biceps. I could ask, what is it? Okay, or I could say, what's the action of this muscle? What's the origin? What's the insertion? Okay, there's a lot of ways, so you really got to look at the table. In general, if I point to a muscle and ask what the action is, you just have to tell me one of the actions. There's if you look in that action column, for some of the muscles, there's several actions listed. Okay, it's kind of like the cranial nerves. You know, when I ask you about the function of the cranial nerves, if there was multiple functions, usually I accepted just one of them. Okay, all right. Another way that I could ask questions from this table is not to even point to a model. I could just ask you a question like, you know, name me a muscle that extends the thigh. It could just be a question like that. No models, nothing. Name me a muscle that extends the thigh. All right? You'd have to say something like the gluteus maximus. Okay. All right. So let me go through just to show you where they are. Moving up So I'll go right in order. Okay. What's this little muscle here? Yeah, that's the masseter muscle, okay? Big chewing muscle. What's this guy coming off to the side here? That's the sternocleidomastoid, okay? There's the sterno origin, the cleido origin, and then the insertion back there on the mastoid process of the temporal bone. Okay? Can't really ask you about the diaphragm on this model because you have to kind of cut inside. So, go to something like this model, or maybe a picture, right? And I don't think anyone's going to have too much trouble finding the diaphragm, right? It's this muscle here, all right? It's the muscle that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. And it's important for inspiration. The external intercostals are little muscles that run between each of the ribs. So again, this model isn't really showing it. Let's see if one of these other guys has it a little bit better over here. They went too deep on that. That stinks. Oh, wait. This one isn't really showing it. Kind of showing it, but not really. Anyway, the intercostal muscles run between the ribs. They're short muscles. They connect one rib up with the next rib. Okay? I don't think it'll be too difficult to see the external intercostals.
Oops.
Losing my... What was this thing? I don't even know what... That's weird. It's like squeaky. It's like a squeaky toy for a dog. That's weird. All right. Let me move over here again. All right. Rectus abdominis. That's your six-pack ab muscle. Okay, rectus abdominis. Big flexor of your trunk. Okay. What else? External oblique is the muscle that comes in from the side here. Okay. That's the external oblique. Erector spinae muscles are another one that I'd have to use probably a picture for. I don't think we have any model yet that shows you the erector spinae. But the erector spinae are on the back, and they're really, really deep in the back. Okay? I'd have to remove this muscle, I'd have to remove that muscle to go down really deep to show you the erector spinae muscles. The erector spinae basically connect vertebrae to vertebrae. Right? So, picture some really long, thin muscles that go and connect like the lower vertebrae with the upper vertebrae, maybe with the ribs a little bit, but picture some really deep, thin muscles. And then picture those muscles contracting, and you can kind of visualize how they would cause you to extend your trunk. Okay? They're like an antagonistic muscle to your rectus abdominis, which makes you do like a sit-up type of move or bow or whatever you want. All right? So that's where the erector spinae muscles would be. I don't think this one. No, this one's not deep enough. So I'd probably have to use like a picture from your textbook. Okay. You know, there's a whole group of erector spinae muscles. You do not need to know each name. Just know that the group collectively is called the erector spinae group.
On the left guide, it says that we need to know all of them.
Where?
Under, it said know the erector spinous muscles.
Well, yeah. I mean, it just means know that they're called the erector spinae muscles. It doesn't.
Okay.
You don't have to know the specific names of each one.
Okay.
Okay. Let's see here. What's this guy here? That's the trapezius. Okay. It's going to shrug the shoulders. It's also going to, depending on how you contract it, it can also cause you to extend your head and look upward. Okay. Serratus anterior. Here it is shown from the side. Okay. See the serrations that I was talking about? That's why they call it that. Okay. It originates on some of the ribs. It then curves around towards your back, and it attaches to your scapula, so that when it contracts, it pulls your whole shoulder forward. Okay. Sometimes call it the boxer's muscle. Okay. Pectoralis major, as you mentioned, here it is. Okay, it's going to pull the arm medially, so it adducts the arm. Okay, because it also has fibers sort of going in an upward direction. It also tends to produce sort of a what would be a flexion of the arm. So it's kind of an over and across. Okay, kind of like you use like with a tennis hit or something like that. Okay. Latissimus dorsi is the big guy that's on the back. Okay. This whole guy is the latissimus dorsi. Curves around, curves around, curves around, curves around, curves around, up and underneath. And then you really can't see it here, but it just has a very small point where it attaches on the humerus. And again, this is the one that's important for extending your arm, actually hyperextending it, pulling it backwards, which is important like when you're swimming. Okay. Deltoid. Deltoid is your shoulder muscle. Here it is. Here. It originates on the scapula and on the clavicle, and then it inserts on the humerus. And so it's an important abductor of the arm. Okay. Biceps brachii. Oh, sorry, that's another thing. Sorry, you're gonna cringe when you hear this, but we don't cringe. But if I point to this, okay, don't just say biceps. Okay. The reason you've got to say biceps brachii, all right, which is listed right there. Okay. The reason why you have to say biceps brachii, anyone know why you have to say that? Because there's another biceps. See it down here? The biceps femoris. We'll get to that in a moment, all right? So if I point to the arm one, make sure you say biceps brachii. If you don't, I'm going to count it wrong. Alright, so that's the biceps brachii, and it flexes your forearm. Okay. On the back of it is your triceps. Okay. And it extends your forearm. Okay. Let's see here. Palmaris longus is an important flexor of the wrist. Okay, like whoa, you just failed A&P, bye, right? This is the important flexor of the wrist. Right? Hopefully that's not good. Okay. Let me back up a little bit. So this is it here. It starts in the forearm. Like, again, most of the muscles that move the hand or move the wrist originate in the forearm. They travel down, and then they insert on the hand. hand. So this guy right here is the palmaris longus, and it's attaching to a really broad tendon that's inside of your hand. Okay. Let's see if there's another image over here on the a little bit. So again, there it is, your palmaris longus, and when it contracts, it flexes your wrist. Okay. All right. Iliopsoas is one that I'd have to go to a special model like this one. That's because to see the iliopsoas, you got to go inside of the pelvis. All right. This is the iliopsoas. Okay. It originates inside of your ilium of your pubic bone, of your pelvic bone. Okay. It originates there, comes down, crosses over the top of your pelvic bone, and then attaches to your femur.
Is that what they call a hip flexor?
It is. It's a hip flexor. Exactly. All right. So when it contracts, it's doing that. Okay. It's flexing the hip. All right. If you want to see it on the skeleton, so picture. And they've actually, I think they tried to draw it in red up here, but this is where the iliacus and the psoas, the iliopsoas would be originating here. It then goes downward, crosses over top of the pubis, and then attaches to or inserts on the femur. So when it contracts, you can literally, you can picture it pulling up on the thigh, flexing the thigh. On the other hand, if you go to the back, okay, let's see, where is it? If you go to the back, you're going to see the antagonistic muscle, this guy, which is the, what is that one? Yeah, the gluteus maximus. It's on the back side, so it's pulling on the femur from behind, and it's going to cause extension of the thigh, right? So it's going to do this move. It's going to pull it backward. All right. All right, where am I? Okay. Tensor fascia latte. This seems like such a weird word. Sounds like something you order at Starbucks. Can I have a tensor fascia latte? Sure. Hold on a second. That's $25. Thanks. What a deal. All right. That's this muscle over on the. Sorry. It's this muscle right here that comes. Right, you can't even see it. This side's better. This muscle that starts here and works its way down is the tensor fascia latte. All right. Can I back up even more? Yeah, a little bit.
Why is it white instead of red?
Well, that's all tendon down there. It's a big tendon called. It's actually called the iliotibial tract. It's just a big, thick tendon.
Okay.
So, anyway, this is the tensor fascia latte. When it contracts, again, you got to get your bearings. Notice it's a very lateral placed muscle. So when it contracts, it. What do you think it does?
It'll lift your leg out.
Yeah, it abducts the thigh and the leg. Okay, so it pulls it off to the side. The antagonist to that then is the next muscle on your list, the adductor. And that's another thing too. If the organization of this list tends to start up high and go down low, and then at the same time it usually gives them in their sort of antagonistic pairs, right? So that's another way in thinking about this list, at least in how I put it together. All right. So tensor fascia latte abducts the thigh. All right. Whereas if you go over medially, okay, you see this guy here, there, or over there. That's the adductor longus, and that adducts the thigh. Another one, weird one to be aware of is this guy here, coming across, okay. Or over here. Anyone know what that muscle is?
Sartorius?
Yeah, that's the sartorius. Now, I'm going to try to get my my root words together. Does it mean tailor in Greek, or is it maybe it's not a Greek word? I don't know.
Which one again?
Sartorius or sartorial?
No.
Do you know? All right. Some language, I'm pretty sure it means like tailor. All right. Like if you talk about somebody in their looking your sartorial splendor, that means you're very well dressed or you're well tailored outfit. All right. Anyway, they call this the sartorius muscle because of how it's tailored or fit to your leg. It's almost like somebody made it to kind of sit across in this funny shape. Anyway, sartorius muscle is kind of a weird muscle because when it contracts, it adducts the leg, so it pulls the leg closer to the midline, but because of how it inserts in its angle, it actually also flexes the leg, causes the leg to bend down there. All right. Okay. Quadriceps muscle, again, it's on the front. As I told you, it really represents 4 separate muscles that then fuse together to form the quadriceps tendon. The 4 muscles are, this is the rectus femoris. Okay. Over here, laterally is the vastus lateralis, medially is the vastus medialis, and then in between the two, or underneath, you can't see it. If I could lift up the rectus femoris, you would see the vastus intermedius. All right. So those are the muscles. Actually, you know what? I think I said it. You should be able to identify the individual muscles. I may have said before you should, because I think there is a question about those. So make sure you know the relative position of those 4. All right. Anyway, together they're important extensors of the leg. Just remember, this is the guy that you hit when you did the patellar tendon reflex. You stretched the quad and caused a reflex extension of the leg. Okay. The antagonistic muscle to the quad, or muscles, are your hamstrings. So you go on the back. All right. These are your hamstrings. Okay. The one that's located lateral is the biceps femoris. Okay. The one that's located medial is something called the semitendinosus. There's another one that's deeper here that you don't have to worry about, but those are the 2 main ones that you can see, biceps femoris and semitendinosus. If you look on this side, here's the biceps femoris and the semitendinosus. They're important flexors of the leg. They do just the opposite from what the quadriceps does. Alright, okay, the last ones that you need to know are down here. Let's see. Oh, maybe I can put it down this way a little better. This is on the anterior surface of your leg. Sits just sort of lateral to where your tibia is. This is the anterior tibialis muscle. Okay. It starts anteriorly on the leg, it goes down, and then it inserts on the top of your foot, so that when it contracts, it causes your foot to move like that. It dorsiflexes the foot. All right. If you go to the back side, you see the antagonistic muscle, which is your big calf muscle, your gastrocnemius. Okay. It's going down, it's inserting on the calcaneus part, and when it contracts, it causes your foot to move downward, and you do the dorsiflexion. You do the plantar flexion. Okay. So anterior tibialis, dorsiflexion, gastrocnemius, plantar flexion. All right, that's it. Any questions? I know it's a lot. Any questions about that stuff? All right. If you haven't physically looked at the models, I would definitely take a moment or two to at least get your hands on it. Also, if you haven't physically looked at the microscope slides, I would take a moment to look at those too, of the cardiac muscle, because it sometimes looks different when you actually see it. And when I do the lab practical, I can potentially show you a real microscope slide. So if you haven't, take a moment. Feel like you got